Lord One Hand, Chapter 37 of Shardik by Richard Adams. The officer, startled, took the emblem and examined it, drawing the chain through the ring and fastening the clasp carefully, as though to allow himself time to think. At length, with an uncertainty that he had not shown before, he said, "Will you be good enough to tell me... I am sure you will understand why I have to know whether this is your own?" Keldrek held out his hand in silence, but the officer, after a moment's hesitation, shook his head. "Have you come here in search of the Commander-in-Chief himself? Perhaps you are a member of his household. If you can tell me, it will make my task easier." Keldrek, to whom the memory was now beginning to return of much that had befallen him since leaving Bekla, sat down upon the bed and put his head in his hands. The officer waited patiently for him to speak. At last Keldrek said, "Where is General Zelda? If he is here, I must see him immediately." "General Zelda?" replied the officer in bewilderment. One of the soldiers spoke to him in a low voice, and together they went to the further end of the room. "This man's an Ortelgan, sir," said the soldier, "or else I'm one myself." "I know that," replied Tanrion. "What of it? He's some agent of Lord Elleroth who's lost his wits." "I doubt he is, sir. If he's an Ortelgan, then clearly he's not a household officer of the Commander-in-Chief. You just heard him ask for General Zelda. I agree, it's plain that some shocks confused his mind, but my guess is that he's made his way into the middle of the wrong army without realizing it. If you come to think of it, he'd hardly be expecting to find us here in Cabin." Tanrion considered. He could still have come by that emblem honestly. In his case, it might be no more than a token to prove who he was working for. Nobody knows what strange people may have been reporting direct to General Erketlis or carrying his messages these last few months. Suppose, for instance, that Lord Elleroth made use of this man while he was in Bekla. When is General Erketlis expected to return, have you heard? "Not until the day after tomorrow, sir. He got wind of a big slave column in the move northwest of Thedet-Nilda and heading for Bekla. To reach it in time meant some very hard going, so the general took 100 men from the Falaran regiment and said he'd do the job himself." "Very like him. I'm only afraid he may try that sort of thing once too often. Well, at that rate, I suppose we'll have to keep this man until he gets back." "I suggest we might ask Lord One Hand, Lord Elleroth, to see him, sir. If he recognizes him, as I gather you yourself think may be possible, then at least we shall know where we are, even if the man doesn't come round to tell us anything." After a few more fruitless questions to Keldrek, Tanrion, together with his 2 soldiers, conducted him out of the house and up on the town walls. Here, walking in the spring sunshine, they looked down upon the town on one side, and on the other upon the huts and bivouacs of the camp in the fields outside. The smoke of fires was drifting on the breeze, and in the market-place a crowd was gathering in response to the long-drawn, stylized summons of a red-cloaked crier. "Must have made his fortune since we came here, eh?" said a sentry on the wall to one of Tanrion's soldiers, jerking his thumb to where the crier below was already climbing onto his rostrum. "I dare say," answered the soldier. "I know I've done well enough out of him. He hangs about our place and offers to pay for anything we can tell him." "Well, just be careful how much you do tell him," snapped Tanrion, turning his head. "You bet, sir. We all want to stay alive." They descended from the wall by a flight of steps near the gate at which Keldrek had entered the town the night before, and, passing through a square, came to a large stone house, where a sentry stood before the door. Keldrek and his escort were taken to a room which had formerly been that of the household steward, while Tanrion, after a few words with the captain of the guard, accompanied that officer through the house and into the garden. The garden, green and formal, was shady with ornamental trees and shrubs, lexus, purple cresset, and sharp-scented planella, already opening its tiny, mauve-speckled flowers to the early sun. Through the midst, murmuring along its gravel bed, ran a brook, channeled down from the reservoir. Along the verge, Elleroth was walking in conversation with a Yellowshay officer, a Dealgai baron, and the governor of the town. He was gaunt and pale, his face haggard with pain and recent privation. His left hand, carried in a sling, was encased to the wrist in a great padded glove of birch bark that covered and protected the dressings beneath. His sky-blue robe, a gift from the wardrobe of Santalkir Ketlis, for he had reached the army in rags, had been embroidered across the breast with the corn sheaves of Sarkid, while the silver clasp of his belt was fashioned in the stag emblem. He walked leaning on a staff, and those beside him carefully suited their pace to his. He nodded courteously to Tanrion and the guard commander, who stood deferentially aside, waiting until he should be ready to hear them. "Of course," Elroth was saying to the governor, "I cannot tell you what the commander-in-chief will decide, but clearly whether the army remains here and for how long will depend not only on the movements of the enemy, but also on the state of our own supplies. We're quite a long way from Ikat," he smiled, "and we shan't be loved up here much longer if we eat everybody out of house and home. The Ortelgan army are in the middle of their own country, or what they call their own country. I dare say we may decide to seek them out and fight them soon, before the balance begins to tip against us. I can assure you that General Erketlis has all this very much in mind. At the same time, there are two excellent reasons why we should like to stay here a little longer, provided you can bear with us, and I assure you that you would not, in the long run, be losers. In the first place, we are doing what we intended, what the enemy supposed we could never do, and what we could not have done without help from Dilgai." He bowed slightly to the Baron, a heavy, swarthy man, showy as a macaw. "We think that if we continue to hold the reservoir, the enemy may feel driven to attack us at a disadvantage. He, for his part, is probably waiting to see whether we shall stay here, so we want to look as though we shall." "You're not going to destroy the reservoir, my lord?" asked the governor anxiously. "Only in the very last resort," answered Elroth cheerfully. "But I'm sure that with your help we shall never come to that, shall we?" The governor replied with a wry smile, and after a few moments Elroth continued. "The second reason is that we are anxious, while we are here, to hunt down as many slave traders as we can. We have already caught not only several who hold warrants for the so-called King of Bekla, but also one or two of those who do not. But, as you know, the country beyond the Rako, right across to Zeray and up as far as the Gap of Linsho, is wild and remote. Here we are on its doorstep. Kabin is the ideal base from which to search it. If only we can gain the time, our patrols will be able to comb out the whole of that area, and believe it or not, we have received a reliable offer of help from Zeray itself." "From Zeray, my lord?" said the governor incredulously. "From Zeray," answered Elroth. "And you told me, didn't you," he went on, turning with a smile to Tanrion, who was still waiting nearby, "that you had information about at least one unlicensed slave trader who is believed to be either beyond the Rako at this moment, or else making towards it from Tanilda?" "Yes, my lord," replied Tanrion, "the child-dealer, Genshed, a most cruel, evil man from Tirkenholt. But Trans-Rako will be a difficult country to search, and he might very well give us the slip even now." "Well, we shall have to do the best we can. So you see, any news of your own trouble, my lord?" broke in the Eldeshay officer impulsively. Elroth bit his lip, and paused a moment before answering. "I'm afraid not, for the time being. So you see," he resumed quickly to the governor, "we are going to need all the help you can give us, and what I would like to learn from you is how we can best feed and supply the army while we stay here a little longer. Perhaps you will be so good as to think about it, and we will have a talk with the commander-in-chief when he returns. We sincerely want to avoid making your people suffer, and as I said, we will pay honestly for your help." The governor was about to withdraw when Elroth suddenly added, "By the way, the priestess from the Teltherna island, the wise woman, you gave her a safe conduct, as I asked you?" "Yes, my lord," replied the governor, "yesterday at noon. She has been gone these 20 hours. "Thank you." The governor bowed and went away through the trees. Elroth stood still, watching a trout that hung in the edge of the current, motionless, save for the flickering of its tail. It darted upstream, and he sat down on a stone bench, easing his hand in the sling, and shaking his head as though at some thought that preoccupied and distressed him. At length, recalling Tanrion, he looked up with a questioning smile. "Sorry to bother you, sir," said Tanrion briskly. "Yesterday evening one of your patrols brought in a wandering Ortelgan, who kept talking about a message to or from Bekla. This morning we found this on him, and I thought best to come and show it to you at once." Elroth took the stab emblem, looked at it, started, frowned, and then examined it more closely. "What does he look like, this man?" he asked at length. "Like an Ortelgan, my lord," replied Tanrion. "Spare and dark. It's hard to say much more. He's pretty well exhausted, half-starved and worn out. He must have had a very bad time." I will see him immediately, said Elroth.